for joining us for the landing of the 3 crew members aboard the Soyuz MS-15 spacecraft: NASA astronaut Jessica Meir, Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Skropochka, and NASA astronaut Andrew Morgan. After undocking at 8:53 p.m. Central Time from the Zvezda module aboard the International Space Station, the Soyuz is approaching the 32-kilometer distance away from the station, where it will conduct its deorbit burn, scheduled for 11:22 p.m. Central Time. Tonight we'll be looking forward to the landing, scheduled for 12:16 a.m. Central Time on April 17th. I'm Leah Cheshire of NASA, and we're live in the International Space Station Flight Control Room here in Houston, Texas at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Teams on the ground tonight are being led by Flight Director Marcos Flores. To his right, you can see Capcom Andreas Mogensen, a European Space Agency astronaut. He's communicating with the astronauts still aboard the station. Meanwhile, the visiting vehicle officer, or Mike Campion, is keeping tabs of everything happening with the Soyuz vehicle now on its way home. You've got a live look here from the balcony of the Russian Mission Control Center in Koryov. This is a town outside of Moscow that where the team will be controlling all of tonight's landing operations. Both the Houston and Moscow flight control teams are fully focused on the landing of the Soyuz MS-15 spacecraft, currently almost 19 miles away from the space station. Inside that spacecraft are NASA's Jessica Meir and Andrew Morgan, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Skropochka, commander of the Soyuz spacecraft. Meanwhile, the landing team here on Earth is preparing to depart aboard helicopters for the landing site from the airfield in Zhezkazgan, Kazakhstan. The Antonov 26 fixed-wing aircraft that will serve as a sort of command and control center, relaying voice and data once the Soyuz is in range, has already departed Baikonur and is en route to the landing site about 2.5 hours away. After Soyuz hatch closure at 5:44 p.m. Central Time tonight, the crew performed leak checks and system checks, ensuring their spacecraft was ready to go, and then donned their white Sokol launch and entry suits. At 8:53 p.m. Central Time, the hooks on the Soyuz spacecraft were opened, and it undocked from the station, taking with it Jessica Meir in the left seat as Board Engineer 1, Drew Morgan in the right seat as Board Engineer 2, and commander of the spacecraft, Oleg Skropochka, in the center seat.
And it's going to be at 07:14:32.
The Soyuz performed a successful separation burn 1, making it depart faster from the International Space Station, and now it's approaching that 19-mile distance necessary for it to execute the deorbit burn. That'll slow the Soyuz down by about 128 meters per second, allowing it to drop out of Earth's orbit and re-enter the atmosphere. As the Soyuz departed tonight, at the moment of undocking, Expedition 63 officially began aboard the International Space Station, with NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy as the commander, joined by Roscosmos cosmonauts Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner, this crew having just arrived last week on the Soyuz MS-16 vehicle. They will be aboard until later this year in October. For a look at how tonight's events will unfold, let's take a look at this animation. Earlier, we saw the undocking of the spacecraft from the Zvezda module at 8:53 p.m. Central Time. The next thing is that deorbit burn, scheduled for 11:22 p.m. Central Time this evening. That burn will last 4 minutes and 41 seconds, dropping the Soyuz out of orbit and into the Earth's atmosphere. At 11:50, the three portions of the Soyuz will pyrotechnically separate, and the descent module will have its heat shield forward to the direction of travel, protecting the crew from the heat buildup reaching about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Once the crew is out of the plasma regime, a series of parachutes will open. First, 2 pilot parachutes and then a drogue chute, and last, the main chutes that will guide the spacecraft down in a 15-minute descent. Just about 2 seconds before the crew touches down on the steppe of Kazakhstan, there will be a soft engine firing, slowing it down just a bit more for a softer landing. The Soyuz will land about 92 miles southeast of the town of Zhezkazgan. A reduced number of NASA personnel are supporting landing, some who were in Kazakhstan last week to support the Soyuz launch and were joined by a small NASA team that flew in on the Gulfstream plane to the city of Kizilorda in central Kazakhstan. Because the airport in Karaganda, which is the normal staging location, was closed by Kazakhstan authorities, the Russian search and recovery forces reworked landing logistics and decided to stage landing operations with helicopters at the airport in Baikonur, since they were already there to support launch last week in event of a contingency. The NASA team has departed Baikonur and actually is in Zhezkazgan, having departed earlier on helicopters. Tonight there will be 8 helicopters deployed. 2 are dispatched to the ballistic landing site east of Baikonur, and 6 are in Zhezkazgan refueling, and they'll prepare to depart soon for the landing site, about a 35-minute flight. And an update, those helicopters are actually already en route to the landing site. They'll be arriving in a racetrack fashion, making an oval around the landing site and then landing sequentially once the capsule has landed. 2 Antonov fixed-wing aircraft are employed. One is in the area of the ballistic site, and the other, as we mentioned earlier, is already en route from Baikonur to the landing site. It will serve as sort of a command and control center between the spacecraft back to Russian mission control personnel. That'll relay voice and data from the Soyuz to the flight controllers at their mission control center, and it'll be able to pick up that data from Soyuz once it is in range. After landing, the crew will return by Russian helicopters to the recovery staging city in Baikonur, which is about a 2.5-hour flight. And this is where the crew will split up after 6 months in orbit together. The NASA crew will move to ground transportation for about a 3-hour ride to the airport in Kizilorda, where they will board a NASA plane located there for a flight back to Ellington Field in Houston. Skripochka will stay in Baikonur, where he will board a Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, or GCTC, aircraft in Baikonur to return to his home in Star City, Russia. We're expecting good weather for landing today at about 61 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies and some winds from the southeast. A nice welcome home for this crew that has spent so much time in space. Yesterday, Jessica Meir spoke about the extensive measures NASA has taken to ensure the safety of the landing team and, of course, the crew. Listen in to learn a little bit more about all of the preparations for their return trip to Earth.
Yeah, this situation has dramatically affected our plans. NASA has done an incredible job. Our support people on the ground have been working very hard to figure out even how to come pick us up. So as you know, we launched in the Soyuz spacecraft from Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and we land in Kazakhstan as well. So normally what happens is a NASA aircraft comes over to pick us up and gets us back to Houston within 24 hours. But of course, even getting that NASA aircraft over there with all the international stops involved has been quite an effort. And we're taking a different path. It's going to be kind of like a planes, trains, and automobiles scenario where I think we're going to even end up riding in an ambulance for several hours across the Kazakh steppe in order to get to our airplane. So it'll be a little bit different than normal, but this is the first time landing for both me and my crewmate Drew Morgan, so we don't really have anything to compare it to. It'll just be the way that it is for us. Once we get home, normally we have, a little bit of a quarantine period, which has been a little bit soft in the past in terms of we can still kind of go about our daily routine. But because one of the hallmarks of spaceflight physiologically is actually a dysregulation of our immune system, we actually can come back potentially a bit immunocompromised. So of course that makes everybody at NASA concerned, and they want to make sure that they keep us safe and healthy. So we'll have a more strict quarantine this time, where we'll be actually staying and living at NASA for at least a week after we land, with very limited access to make sure that we remain healthy as well.
NASA astronaut Andrew Morgan actually launched on July 20th, 2019, the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 lunar landing. Today, he, Jessica Meir, and Alex Grapochka land 50 years to the day of the Apollo 13 safe landing. In 1970, 50 years ago, the crisis was in space as flight controllers worked to bring the Apollo 13 crew safely home. 50 years later, things are a little more difficult on this side of the atmosphere as we navigate life during a pandemic. In both circumstances, we are united worldwide as we work to move forward to better days. We're about 10 minutes away from that deorbit burn, a 4-minute and 41-second burn that will bring the Soyuz, slowing it down by 128 meters per second. That's enough to drop it out of the Earth's atmosphere, or out of the Earth's orbit, which is exactly what we want tonight, to bring it home safely to the steppe of Kazakhstan. At the time of the deorbit burn, the Soyuz will be about 32 kilometers or 19 miles away from the International Space Station. About 5 minutes after that deorbit burn is completed, the orbital module, the bulbous portion on top of the descent module where the crew is seated, will be depressurized to vacuum. That sets up the systems for the pyrotechnic separation of the modules. Once the modules pyrotechnically separate, that orbital module will depart at 0.82 meters per second, and the propulsion module at the bottom will depart at 0.58 meters per second, leaving the descent module and the crew inside with their heat shield exposed in the direction of travel. That's important to note because the temperatures around the descent module will build up to about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat shield will protect the astronauts inside as they enter that plasma regime. At that time, it's expected that we won't have any communications with the Soyuz crew, but those should be restored upon exit once the spacecraft is in range of the Antonov aircraft. You'll hear a beacon signal once that occurs, just before the parachute deployment and about 15 minutes prior to landing. The command to open the chutes should come about 2 minutes after midnight when the Soyuz is at an altitude of 6.5 miles. That command is triggered by a barometric pressure sensor at an altitude of 41,000 feet. 2 pilot parachutes are first deployed, the second of which extracts the drogue chute. The drogue chute is then released, and that measures about 24 square meters, slowing down the Soyuz from a descent rate of 230 meters a second down to 80 meters a second. The main parachute is then released, covering an area of 1,000 meters, a massive parachute. It allows the Soyuz to slow to a descent rate of 7.2 meters per second.
Oxygen. Copy.
принято. Можно выдавать Т3, С9.
We got Bill, and you can send T3 and S9 commands.
We'll be coming up on that deorbit burn at 11:22 p.m. Central Time. A little bit more about the crew. Until then, as we mentioned, Drew Morgan is actually wrapping up a 272-day mission aboard the International Space Station, his first mission to the space station, and the fourth longest single space flight by a U.S. astronaut. He also completed 7 spacewalks on this mission, with over 45 hours and 48 minutes outside the hatch.
Firing is going to be at 07:21:32. Copy.
NASA astronaut Jessica Meir was on her first spaceflight this mission, racking up 205 days and 3 spacewalks, all completed with NASA astronaut Christina Koch for the first all-female spacewalks. Oleg Skropochka, the commander of today's Soyuz spacecraft and the commander of Expedition 62, added another 205 days, totaling his career flight time to 536 days in space. Meir and Skropochka added up about 86.9 million statute miles traveled around the Earth during their flight.
Форматы. Во время
Форматы.
просьба вести репортаж.
Please report during thruster firing.
30 секунд отработанных.
Just let us know 30 seconds. What was the
В норме и
impulse and what was the delta V and how much propellant was used. Copy.
About 5 minutes away now from that deorbit burn, committing Soyuz to deorbit and its journey home. Though 3 spacefarers are coming home tonight, 3 more are still living and working on the space station for about 6 months. That includes NASA's Chris Cassidy and Ivan Wagner and Anatoly Ivanishin of Roscosmos. This trio arrived just 8 days ago, beginning a journey scheduled to last until October, and they'll see the visit of the SpaceX Crew Dragon on its DM-2 mission, the first launch of humans from space since the retirement of the Space Shuttle in 2011. A good view here of the world map as the space station and Soyuz cross over the southern tip of Chile. The space station at 273 statute miles above the Earth, traveling about 17,500 miles per hour. The space station orbits the Earth every 90 minutes, seeing 16 sunrises and sunsets every day. Just 2 minutes now until Soyuz's next major milestone, the deorbit burn for 4 minutes and 41 seconds in duration. And we're about 1 minute away from that braking maneuver, the deorbit burn.
We're sending J3 command and
Принято.
SKD time.
Ожидаем включения СКД через 30
We are
секунд.
standing by for SKD activation in 30 seconds.
30 seconds until the deorbit burn.
Да, принято.
We copy.
Есть ГСО 1-2, ГСО обобщенная.
And I confirm GSO 1 and 2 and combined GSO and SKD activation at 2:32.
And the deorbit burn is in progress. That retrograde firing lasting 4 minutes and 41 seconds. This will slow down the Soyuz spacecraft by 128 meters per second, allowing it to drop out of orbit and back into the Earth's atmosphere.
0:45 and I confirm SKD
Отработали 30.
thruster firing.
Расход 30, скорость 14.8, NX 45.
And we confirm that we used 30 kilograms of propellant and delta V was 14.8. We copy all.
Минута, расход
1 minute.
52.
1 minute into the deorbit burn.
Delta V
Принято.
is 28 and we've used up 0.62.
Минута 30.
1 minute 30.
Расход 90, скорость 40.
We used up 90. Delta V is 40.
Принято.
We copy.
Две минуты, расход
2 minutes.
45,
2 minutes into the deorbit burn, about 2 minutes and 41 seconds remaining.
And
Приняли.
I confirm we've used up 150. Delta V notable. Copy.
2:30, расход
2:30, 1:56, burn, inaudible, and Delta V 046. We copy.
Три минуты, расход
3 minutes.
87, импульс 82, ускорение 046.
The deorbit burn continues and the crew is now committed to entry of the Earth's atmosphere.
Три 30, расход
3:30.
19, импульс 96, ускорение 047. Принято.
219 used up, burn 96, and Delta V is 047. We copy.
The commander reporting down to Russian Mission Control the amount of fuel that has been used so far for the deorbit burn. Everything proceeding smoothly.
4 минуты, расход
4 minutes.
4 minutes into the deorbit burn, there will be 41 seconds left.
Used up 251 of kilograms of propellant, burn is 110, and Delta V is 047. We copy all.
Четыре 30,
4:30.
283, импульс 125.
Deorbit burn almost complete.
Есть ГК.
We confirm GECA. Thruster firing. Propellant used up 283. Burn 125. Delta V is 047. We copy all.
And at 11:27 p.m. Central Time, that deorbit burn is complete. The crew is committed to deorbiting and entering Earth's atmosphere. About 5 minutes from now, the orbital module, the bulbous module on top of the Soyuz, will be depressurized to vacuum, preparing for the pyrotechnic separation of the modules.
Confirm drop of the pressure in BO. And we confirm separation. We copy all.
And with that, 5 minutes from the start of the burn, the orbital module has been depressurized to vacuum.
We are working for page
55.
55.
Принято.
We copy.
Да.
With the deorbit burn complete and depressurization of the orbital module, the next step for Soyuz will be the separation of the modules. That'll be at 11:50 p.m. Central Time. The orbital module will depart at 0.82 meters per second, and the propulsion module will depart at 0.58 meters per second, leaving behind only the descent module in which the crew is seated inside.
810 stable.
КСС режим готовности и отжать тангенты.
And please depress
Связь нажатием тангенты
the
фиксатора.
push to talk buttons, and that needs to be done at -6. Please make sure that your seats are primed. We copy.
Almost 3 minutes after the separation of the modules, the crew will begin to feel the first pulls of gravity during the entry interface. The first time that Andrew Morgan will have felt gravity in almost 9 months, and 6 months for NASA astronaut Jessica Meir and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Skripochka. Just about 20 minutes from that separation of the Soyuz modules, everything moving as planned for an on-time landing at 12:16 a.m. April 17th, Central Time. The returning Soyuz MS-15 crew of NASA astronaut Jessica Meir is in the left seat of the Soyuz descent module. She's board engineer 1, serving as the backup to Oleg Skropochka, the Soyuz commander, in the middle seat. And on his right side, Drew Morgan, who just spent 272 days in space, in the right seat as board engineer 2. Meanwhile, on the ground, NASA and Russian search and recovery forces are in the air aboard the Russian Mi-8 helicopters on the way from Zhezkazgan to the landing site, about 92 miles away. That's about a 35-minute flight, and they will circle the landing site in a racetrack fashion, awaiting for the arrival of the vehicle. Next milestone for Soyuz will be that module separation. And following that, they'll hit the first traces of the Earth's atmosphere about 3 minutes later. They'll then enter the plasma regime, which lasts about 5 minutes when the temperatures around the Soyuz spacecraft build to about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is that time that we expect to lose communication between the Soyuz and the ground teams, but those will be restored upon the exit of the plasma regime when the Soyuz spacecraft is in range of that Antonov 26 aircraft on its way to the landing site from Baikonur.
Московской с Арматом, давление высоко 810, стабильно, ПО 0.
Moscow, this is Sarmate. BO pressure is 0 and descent module pressure is stable. We copy.
Everything moving along as planned for Soyuz tonight, about 15 minutes until module separation. You're looking at a live view of the Russian Mission Control Center in Koryov, a town just outside of Moscow where teams are in communication with the Soyuz crew. You may hear this team refer to the Soyuz MS-15 as Sarmat. That's the call sign that Oleg Skropochka, the commander of the spacecraft, chose for the Soyuz. It's been about 10 minutes since a successful completion of that deorbit burn, and we're looking at about 40 minutes until landing. Landing of the crew tonight will look a little bit different as it is usually staged out of the Karaganda location. That airport has been closed by Kazakhstan authorities, and so the landing is being staged out of Baikonur. That's about a 2.5-hour helicopter flight from the landing site. After landing, the crew will return by Russian helicopters to that staging city of Baikonur, and then will split up. The NASA crew will move in a 3-hour ride on the ground to the airport in Kizlorda, where they will depart for Ellington Field in Houston aboard a Gulfstream aircraft. Meanwhile, Oleg Skropochka will board a Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center aircraft in Baikonur to return to Star City, Russia. We're about 10 minutes away from module separation. Things will start moving very quickly for the Soyuz crew after that. At 11:53, they will hit the first traces of Earth's atmosphere, and then 2 minutes later move into the plasma regime. That plasma regime is when we expect to lose communications with the crew, and then they'll exit that regime at at midnight Central Time, experiencing about 4 to 5 Gs at that time. That's the maximum G loads the crew should feel during their return to Earth tonight. 2 minutes after midnight, the command to open the parachutes will begin. We'll first see those 2 pilot parachutes, the second of which extracts the drogue chute. The drogue chute is then released, and that extracts the main parachute, covering an area of 1,000 meters. That'll slow the Soyuz to a descent rate of 7.2 meters per second. Just about 2 seconds before Soyuz touches down, its soft landing engines will fire. That's 6 engines to slow the Soyuz descent rate to 1.5 meters per second. Once again, landing is scheduled for 12:16 a.m. Central Time at 47.19 degrees north latitude, 69.34 degrees east longitude, about 92 miles away from Zhezkazgan, Kazakhstan.
Moscow, Sarmade.
Принято.
We closed our visors and we are ready. We copy.
Также формата достать.
Sarmade.
Рукав.
Unintelligible.
Принято.
The crew has reported that they have closed their helmet visors as we are about 5 minutes away from the module separation of the Soyuz. The orbital module has already been depressurized to a vacuum, and the systems are ready for the pyrotechnic separation.
Please report if there is a possible calm pass. Please tell us what was the maximum G load at that time and report how you're feeling.
As the Soyuz approaches its module separation here on the ground, the helicopters are at the landing site, circling the landing zone in a racetrack fashion, having departed Jezkazgan earlier, about a 35-minute flight away. Once the spacecraft lands, the helicopters will then land sequentially and tend to the crew. Coming up on 2 minutes until module separation at 11:50 and 44 seconds p.m. Central Time.
Moscow, Sarmate.
Разделение и управляемый спуск L5.
And we are confirming separation. We are sending L5 command. Copy.
Принято.
Unintelligible. We copy.
Only 1 minute remains until the Soyuz spacecraft is divided into 3 portions, the descent module pyrotechnically separating from the orbital module and propulsion module, preparing it for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere.
Принято.
Sarmate, unintelligible. We copy, Sarmate.
And we have module separation right on time. The descent module now apart from the orbital module and propulsion module on its way back to Earth. In about 3 minutes, the crew will hit the first traces of Earth's atmosphere. That'll be their first time to feel gravity in months. And then a minute and a half later, we'll see that heat ablated from the heat shield as they enter the plasma regime. That's when we will lose communication with the crew for about 5 minutes. About 2 minutes after midnight, the parachutes will deploy. 2 pilot parachutes first, and then the drogue chute and the main parachute, and then those soft landing engines firing just seconds before landing on the steppes of Kazakhstan. About 1 minute away until the crew enters the entry interface portion of their return, the first time to feel gravity. They could expect to feel about 4 to 5 Gs during this portion. The Soyuz crew of astronauts Andrew Morgan, Jessica Meir, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Skropochka should now be in the entry interface portion of their return to Earth. At 11:55 p.m. Central Time, they will enter the plasma regime. This is when the temperatures will build to about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit outside of the capsule, but the heat shield is protecting the astronaut and cosmonaut inside. Upon the exit from the plasma regime, the Soyuz will have the opportunity to restore its communication once it's in the range of the Antonov aircraft. We'll be looking to hear a beacon signal once that occurs. That'll be just before the parachute deployment, scheduled for 2 minutes after midnight. The Soyuz is now in that plasma regime. This should last about 5 minutes, and the astronauts are feeling the maximum G loads of 4 to 5 Gs, the most they will feel upon their return to Earth. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Mi-8 helicopters and the NASA and Russian crews are awaiting the spacecraft to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. The Soyuz spacecraft is now only about 20 minutes from landing, scheduled for 12:16 a.m. Central Time, on the steppes of Kazakhstan, about 92 miles away from Zhezkazgan. About 2 minutes until the crew exits the plasma regime. And just moments away from the exit from the plasma regime for the crew and the end of the maximum G loads they will feel on their return to Earth. The crew should now be out of the plasma regime, and the next step for the Soyuz is to open those parachutes. That should happen at about 12:02 and 12 seconds Central Time. And we've regained communications with the crew. They have reported that they are feeling well.
3, 2, Sarmara unintelligible.
Those data and flight voice being relayed from the Antonov fixed-wing aircraft flying near the landing site. In about 1 minute, Soyuz will open its parachutes, and we are currently about 15 minutes away from Soyuz landing. And the command to open the parachutes on the Soyuz should be coming right about now, as it is 6.5 miles above the Earth. The first of those parachutes will be 2 pilot parachutes, the second of which extracts the drogue chute. The drogue chute is then released, which measures 24 square meters. That'll slow the Soyuz down from a descent rate of 230 meters per second to just 80 meters per second. After the drogue chute is released, the main parachute will be released, covering an area of 1,000 meters. That slows the Soyuz to a descent rate of 7.2 meters per second. The harnesses on the main parachute will first allow the Soyuz to descend at an angle of 30 degrees to expel heat. It will then shift the Soyuz to a straight vertical descent. At about 21,325 feet above the Earth, a barometric pressure sensor starts a timer, triggering most of the remaining events in the landing sequence. Only 12 minutes away from a scheduled landing, under a clear blue sky for the Soyuz today, we would typically be seeing something called venting. All the valves will be open to vent the hydrogen peroxide or H2O2 fuel for the entry control thrusters and the oxygen in the life support system tank. Due to this, a white vapor is emitted. That's a combination of the hydrogen peroxide and oxygen venting into the air. That is intended to save the vehicle for landing, so there aren't any hazardous gases remaining in the tanks when those soft landing thrusters fire just about 2 seconds before Soyuz touches down. Search and recovery teams are in communication with the Soyuz crew, and they continue to be feeling well during their descent to Earth. The crew is now about 10 minutes away from scheduled landing. It should be floating under clear and cloudless blue skies south of Zhezkazgan, Kazakhstan, about 92 miles southeast to be specific. That 7.2 foot wide and 6.9 foot high descent module suspended underneath a white and orange striped parachute covering an area of 1,000 meters and making the capsule below it appear pretty small. Ground teams reporting that the vehicle is in sight. We're about 8 minutes away from the scheduled landing of the Soyuz MS-15 crew. NASA's Jessica Meir and Andrew Morgan and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Skripochka making their return to Earth. Search and recovery forces are currently in air in the Mi-8 helicopters, circling the landing site and awaiting for the vehicle to touch down.
Sarmate unintelligible.
And we are 6 minutes away from the scheduled landing of the Soyuz MS-15. The spacecraft should be currently hanging symmetrically underneath that orange and white striped main parachute rather than at the angle it was before to help it vent and expel heat.
Unintelligible.
As you can hear, the search and recovery forces are in communication with the crew, still floating down to land about 92 miles southeast of Jeskisgan, Kazakhstan, in the steppes, a very desolate area, but with great weather today, looking at about 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Soyuz will continue on its descent with its parachute. The next milestone and the last milestone before landing being that soft landing engine firing. That'll be 6 engines which will fire to slow the Soyuz descent rate to 1.5 meters per second when it's less than 1 meter above the ground. The Mi-8 helicopters have eyes on the vehicle. They are now following it to the landing site, and everyone reports that they are feeling well. Just 2 minutes away from the scheduled landing of the Soyuz MS-15. About 1 minute away from the scheduled landing of Jessica Meir, Oleg Skripochka, and Andrew Morgan. We're awaiting confirmation of the landing of the Soyuz MS-15 crew. Again, we're waiting for confirmation of the return of Andrew Morgan, Oleg Skropochka, and Jessica Meir aboard the Soyuz MS-15 spacecraft. We're without our usual landing footage today, and so we are awaiting that confirmation. And we have confirmed landing of the crew at approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 1:16 a.m. Eastern Time, and 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time, almost 5 hours after sunrise at the landing site. Jessica Meir, Oleg Skropochka, and Drew Morgan have returned. The vehicle has been reported by the Russian search and recovery forces to be on its side. Those Mi-8 helicopters should be landing near the vehicle shortly to extract the crew from the Soyuz module. To recap, the Soyuz MS-15 crew landed at approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 1:16 a.m. Eastern, and 11:16 a.m. local time, Kazakhstan time. The Russian search and recovery forces reported that the vehicle is on its side, and the Mi-8 helicopters have now landed and will begin the recovery process of the crew. This is a view of the Russian Mission Control Center. To recap, the Soyuz MS-15 is on the ground in Kazakhstan, having landed at its scheduled time, approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time. The vehicle landed on its side, as reported by Russian search and recovery forces, not an unprecedented landing. And the Mi-8 helicopters have now landed around the capsule and are working to retrieve and extract the crew. This is a view from the balcony of the Russian Mission Control Center outside of Moscow in the town of Koryov. This is where landing operations were controlled tonight. We continue to await information about the Soyuz crew and their landing after it touching down at approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time. Again, as we reported earlier, Russian search and recovery forces have reported that the Soyuz spacecraft is on its side. Again, not an unusual thing for the Soyuz. It landed and then was potentially pulled over by its orange and white parachute, that large parachute covering an area of 1,000 meters. We're hoping to get a video of the landing site to see some footage of the crew being extracted prior to their departure for Baikonur and eventually their respective homes in Houston, Texas, and Star City outside of Moscow. It was reported earlier that search and recovery forces are on the ground with the Soyuz capsule, having landed on those Mi-8 helicopters. They will first safe the vehicle and then begin extracting the crew. It'll be the first time outside in 6 months for Oleg Skripochka and Jessica Meir, and 9 months for NASA astronaut Andrew Morgan. Now with the fourth longest single duration mission for an American. And we have video at the landing site. You can see the Soyuz is indeed on its side, and search and recovery forces are working to extract the crew from the capsule. You can see the teams wearing masks. This is a precautionary measure. It's part of the pre-planned measures implemented by the Russian search and recovery forces in order to protect all involved in the recovery of the crew and the crew themselves.
We've got the commander.
And we've got a view of Commander Oleg Skripochka first out of the hatch.
Welcome back, guys. Please step away. Please keep the distance, as the president has told us. Oleg, you probably can't recognize anybody with all these masks.
Again, that's Commander Oleg Skripochka getting his first breath of fresh air in 6 months after having spent 205 days aboard the International Space Station, bringing his career total of days in space to 536.
Welcome back.
You can see Skripochka is seated outside of the capsule. It's a beautiful day at the landing site, about 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Once NASA astronauts Andrew Morgan and Jessica Meir are brought out of the capsule, they'll have a chance to sit down as well to regain their equilibrium after such a long time in microgravity before being moved to those helicopters.
Oleg, do you recognize us?
Commander Oleg Skripochka now donning some sunglasses to help him readjust to that bright sunlight that he hasn't experienced in over 205 days.
Put him right here, right here.
And now out of the capsule, NASA astronaut Jessica Meir, having returned from 205 days in space, her first mission aboard the International Space Station.
Who's that? That's Jessica.
Jessica Meir sharing some smiles as NASA flight doctors conduct a post-landing medical check. And we have the extraction of Andrew Morgan, having returned from 272 days aboard the International Space Station, almost 9 months on his first mission away from Earth. With that landing at approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time and 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time, Earth has regained 3 of its residents: Roscosmos' Oleg Skropochka and NASA's Jessica Meir and Andrew Morgan. Crew members are now getting the chance to talk with family members on the phones. They will soon board helicopters in their white Sokol suits, those launch entry suits you see them wearing now. They will then change inside the helicopters for a 2.5-hour flight to Baikonur. That's where they'll split up for the first time in 6 months. Mir and Morgan will be driven to the NASA plane in Kizlorda, and Skropochka will board the GCTC plane, or Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, in Baikonur. NASA astronaut Jessica Meir back on Earth after 205 days and 3 historic spacewalks, the first all-female spacewalks with her friend and crewmate Christina Cook. And another look at NASA astronaut Drew Morgan, smiling, getting his first breath of fresh air and the feeling of sunlight after 9 months aboard the International Space Station. You can see the NASA doctors conducting that post-landing medical check, ensuring everything is going well for Andrew Morgan and Jessica Meir after their return to Earth. The Soyuz spacecraft having touched down at approximately 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time. Commander Oleg Skropochka, no stranger to a return to Earth, wrapping up his third spaceflight with 536 total days in space. NASA astronaut Andrew Morgan, reclining in his chair, regaining that equilibrium, those land legs, after 272 days in space. Next up, the crew will move to those helicopters for a 2.5-hour flight to Baikonur. They'll change out of their Sokol suits into some more comfortable flight suits along the way before splitting up upon landing and returning to their respective homes in Star City and Moscow and Houston, Texas.
Right, are you ready? Ivan. Now, what about the 10th? Sergei Arkadyevich.
Only 4 hours ago, this trio undocked from the Zvezda port of the International Space Station, the Soyuz performing well on the way down and bringing them to land about 92 miles southeast of Zhezkazgan, Kazakhstan. That landing time confirmed at 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time, about 5 hours after sunrise at the landing site. The crew appearing to be doing well and in good spirits, and now Andrew Morgan speaking on the telephone, likely with family members. Some more smiles from NASA astronaut Jessica Meir and first photos from return to Earth. And you now see Commander Oleg Skropochka being carried to some ATVs that will drive him a short distance to the Mi-8 helicopters. Once inside those helicopters, the crew will change out of their Sokol suits into more comfortable flight suits before returning to Baikonur.
You can probably put him in with a whole seat.
Skropochka already on his feet, climbing into that ATV and preparing for a helicopter ride of about 2.5 hours.
Careful. Watch his head. Stop filming us.
All right, Jessica, go now to the ATV.
And Jessica Meir now being moved, waving at the camera on her way to an ATV that will also drive her just a very short distance to the helicopter waiting nearby. As we mentioned, a successful landing at a confirmed time of 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 11:16 a.m. local time, which is in Kazakhstan, about 5 hours after sunrise at the landing site. We just got a good view of the 3 crew members, Oleg Skropochka, commander of that Soyuz spacecraft, and NASA astronauts Andrew Morgan and Jessica Meir having been extracted from the Soyuz spacecraft. It did land and was then tilted to its side, but the crew appears to be feeling well. And their next step is to doff their Sokol suits, those white launch and entry suits, as soon as they arrive in those Mi-8 helicopters. Those helicopters will take them on a 2.5 to 3 hour flight to Baikonur. That's the staging city for tonight. And after landing, they will split up, Skropochka boarding a Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center plane to Star City, Russia, and the NASA team going on about a 3-hour ride in some vehicles that will drive them to the NASA plane in Kizlorda for their flight home. You're looking at a live view in the Russian Mission Control Center in Koryov outside of Moscow, where the teams controlled a successful landing operation of the Soyuz MS-15 spacecraft, bringing with it NASA astronaut Andrew Morgan, returning from 272 days in space, his first mission, as well as NASA astronaut Jessica Meir and commander of the Soyuz spacecraft Oleg Skropochka, both achieving 205 days on this mission. Landing was successful and touched down at 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time. The crew has been extracted from the vehicle. They will now board helicopters and make their way toward the staging city of Baikonur. Today's journey home for the Soyuz MS-15 and its crew of Andrew Morgan, Oleg Skropochka, and Jessica Meir began with the Soyuz hatch closer at 5:44 p.m. Central Time. Just a few hours later at 8:53 and 30 seconds p.m. Central Time, the hooks on the spacecraft were opened and the Soyuz MS-15 undocked from the station, taking with it its crew. All systems executed successfully tonight, and the Soyuz touched down on the Kazakhstan steppe at 12:16 a.m. Central Time, 11:16 a.m. Kazakhstan time. That brings Andrew Morgan's mission to an end after 272 days. He is now the holder of the title for the fourth longest single spaceflight by a U.S. astronaut. Jessica Meir's mission ended after 205 days, her first trip to the International Space Station, and commander of the Soyuz, Oleg Skropochka, ended his mission after 205 days aboard the space station as well, his third flight now totaling 536 days in his spaceflight career. The crew was successfully extracted from the Soyuz spacecraft, and the next steps for them are a 2.5 to 3 hour helicopter flight to Baikonur. They'll change out of those Sokol launch and entry suits into more comfortable flight suits, but after landing in Baikonur, the crew will split up for the first time in 6 months. Oleg Skropochka will board the GCTC plane back to Star City and his home, while the NASA team will move to ground vehicles that will take them to the NASA plane in Kizlorda for their flight back to Ellington Field in Houston. And with their landing tonight, Earth has regained 3 of its residents. And thanks for joining us on our journey. We'll wrap our coverage for the night. This is Mission Control Houston.